Good evening, everyone, from the KingsFund on Periscope. We're looking forward to a terrific evening this evening. Of course, it wouldn't be possible without our sponsors, Interserve, and we'd like to thank them for their loyal support. And of course, our principal sponsors this evening, IMS Maxims, who always start us off with a cheery word to speed us on our way. And let's give a very warm welcome to Michael Thick, who has prepared a 45-minute speech.
You can only say that Roy Lilley is as patronising when he's polite as he is when he's rude.
I can't win!
It's a great pleasure to welcome Jim, who has got, I think, probably the most interesting job in the NHS at the moment. From our perspective as a supplier of transformation services and systems to support that, we're obviously interested to hear how that reflects in his world and how he sees the world of transformation happening, given the rather difficult world between commissioners and providers that exist at the moment. I wish you well.
Hello, Michael.
Thank you very much. Well, let's just find out who everybody is. Who's not been to HealthChat before? Put your hand up. Fine, thank you. Why not? There's nothing on the telly. No. What we try and do is to bring the big names in the health service closer to us all, to find out what they really like and what their views are, and what they're going to do for the future, and how they're going to end the junior doctor strike, and all that kind of stuff. So we've got a really interesting guest tonight, someone who we've admired enormously as a trust chief executive. Terry, aka the Blonde, and I went up and visited his trust, and it's a stunning place, and since then he's moved on, and he's now the boss of Not Monitor. I think we call it, don't we? So Not Monitor. And so let's give a very warm welcome to the chief executive of NHSI. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, Jim Mackey. Jim, thank you very much. And we were talking earlier about your travel arrangements. I mean, working in London and living in the north is not easy, is it?
No, it's hard, but I've always been a big family man, and I'm a Geordie, might have been able to tell already by the accent. I love the North East. Part of the deal was I could stay living in the North East, so I spent 3 days in London. I try and do 2 in the North. Usually one of those days is a visit day where I'm somewhere else.
Yeah.
But I'm always been a big believer in work-life balance.
But it does really destroy your family life, doesn't it?
If you're not careful.
It's knackering as well, isn't
It's
it?
tiring. But actually the time on the train's the only piece I get.
Yeah, but you have to travel second class, don't you? I mean,
Absolutely.
who travels second class? I mean, it's ridiculous. What's it like these days? Is it?
Ask your butler.
Not even my butler travels second class. That's ridiculous, isn't it? Because I know, because although you all gasp when I tell you this, that I have an old geezer's travel card, and if you plan a bit in advance, you could travel the length of this country for tuppence and still travel first class. It's a potty arrangement.
Yeah, well, I actually travel first class, but I charge second class. I claim second class.
Oh, right. Oh, there you are. There's a little insight. You didn't know about it, did you? Well, talking of the insight, I mean, the interesting thing about it, Jim, is that if you, I never do any research to do any of these things. I'm a gossip, and I can talk to anybody about the NHS. I think if you not interested in the NHS and you can't talk to the big names in the NHS for an hour and a half, you shouldn't be doing the job. But I do sometimes, well, I always, in fact, have a leaf through someone's CV. And there was a fantastic one evening when I ended up having a row with Simon Stevens about where he actually went to university. I felt I knew better than he did. I don't know quite how that happened. You have no CV to flick through. That's because if you look at your official CV, it doesn't go back further than 1990. Mm-hmm. Now, either it is true that you are a Martian and you have been landed here, or let's go back a bit. You were born in the North East. Tell me about your family.
Yeah,
What's your backstory?
I was born and bred in a place called Heaven, on the south bank of the Tyne. It's a shipbuilding town.
Yeah.
And I left school after my A-levels. My family was quite hard up. I had places at university, and I went on holiday with my mates to get drunk after came back, and my mum had an application form for a trainee accounting job, and so I filled it in, went for an interview, Tynemere County Council, 6 months before abolition, and started there. And on abolition, we all had lots of job offers. So I trained in local government, finished my accountancy training, and came into the NHS in 1990 on the back of the market reforms.
Right. And I mean, I suppose it'd be interesting just to talk. I mean, since then, of course, local government has changed enormously, hasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean,
Recognised.
absolutely. I have a background in local government as well, but you know, it's unrecognisable now to what it was. And the move towards a greater alignment of services with social care and so on and so forth. I mean, we at the Academy, we've got stunning examples of how it does work, but it is very clunky to make it work, isn't it? Because they just aren't really aligned, and a lot of it's around finance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all these things are about relationships. We were really lucky in Northumberland in that for years Northumberland had a care trust back in the, you know, whenever that was, sort of 2000 sort of time. I ran the care trust for a year on secondment in 2004-05 because they got into financial trouble. But that was the start of the blurring of it all out, so really quite forward looking at the time. So when I left Northumbria, we had one person who ran social care and our community services. It was on my board, and it was Deputy Chief Executive Council. And I think that was the best situation where we actually, none of us bothered to settle up at any time. We just knew what we needed to do. And you look across the country now and you see just really terrible relationships and arguments largely driven by an absence of money.
Yeah.
I do think at some point we've got to wake up to that and deal with, you know, what are we going to do for the elderly largely, because what we're doing now isn't going to work.
I was reading somewhere that there was a thought that the Treasury might make joint allocations to health and social care, because at the moment it's slightly awkward, isn't it? This Section 75 rule or something.
You've got to do all that pool budget malarkey.
Yeah.
You know, I think a lot of these things are instruments to hide behind.
Can you explain the pool budget thing in words of one syllable?
I'll have a go then. So, so we go back when the money's voted from Parliament. It's voted from a particular purpose. So the social care bit still goes down the local authority pipe, and the NHS bit goes down the NHS pipe. And to move the money or to spend it on other purposes, you have to have these section whatever agreements to blur that where there's more flexibility.
Yeah, now the interesting thing is that we've been able to do joint projects going back to the Blair days, haven't we, really?
Yeah.
But it's around the governance, isn't it, now? I mean, if you look at the Better Care Fund, apart from nicking a shitload of money from the NHS and giving it to social care, it's not actually made the application of funds any easier.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I'm not sure a single allocation would help. I think we need to deal with the root cause, which is helping people locally work things out and look after their people and be less precious about the health pound or the social care pound. They're generally they're largely old people, aren't they? So it's largely about how we work together to look after old people. And it's not as discreet as you're in a health box, you know, 10 to 6, and at 5 past 6 you're in a social care box. And I think we have lots of silly discussions about that. We need to be much more flexible. I think as providers we need to be more pragmatic as well. And if you've got a ward that's full of old people who need to be at home and that's costing £3 million, then it might cost you £1 million to sort home care out. Sort home care out. Why get so hung up on, you know, it's somebody else's money? It's still they're in your bed. They need to be looked after.
And you did that, didn't you? When you were running your trust, you had a fantastic relationship with the local authority. In fact, didn't they lend you the money to buy your PFI out?
Yeah,
This is astonishing, isn't it?
They loaned the money for the PFI buyback. They provided a loan for the new Berwick Community Hospital. Just a generally fantastic relationship. Which
it's because you've got good covenants to borrow.
And they have
and they got the access, they got a borrowing ability but don't have the covenants. You've got the covenants and no borrowing. So coming together, what is that joint borrowing then?
No, they borrowed it through the Public Works Loan Board and passed it on to us. There's a bit of premium in it for them. There's a broader partnership agreement about how we do things together, and it was a natural thing of we're trying to do lots of things together. We look after the same population. In that patch, we were without question the 2 main employers. In some parts of that area, NHS is the only employer, so you have to take a much broader kind of social responsibility. It's helped by some of our board members had been council leaders at training local government. The council chief executive was an ex-NHS finance director. We're all intertwined, looking after the public. That's what our job is.
So that was a kind of precursor to Devo Mac, wasn't it, in a sort of a funny way?
Sort of.
Yeah, have you had anything to do with Devo Mac?
I've been up, I've met.
That's
them,
Manchester, incidentally.
Yeah, I know a lot of the individuals.
Yeah. We've been trying to jack up a HealthChat in Manchester, but they've, I don't know why. I can't imagine why they wouldn't want to come and talk about it. But they won't. But Devo Mank elsewhere. I mean, Birmingham have said no. I think Lincoln don't want to do it.
Yeah.
There's a bigger list of people who don't want to do it than the list that do, I think.
Yeah, and I think there's a message in that for us. My view is we should allow local people to do what's right for them, and a model that works in Manchester, might not work in Lincolnshire. They've got different needs, they've got different relationships. Whether what their aspiration is, whether that's brought to fruition, who knows? But at least they're having a go. I think that's the key point. They're having a go. They're trying something different. What's working, what's happening now isn't working.
But it is a kind of a politician's nightmare, isn't it? When you talk about, I mean, Simon, when he was talking about the 5-year forward view, Simon Stevens was saying this is not let 1,000 flowers bloom, but it's to let quite a few flowers bloom. It's a regulatory nightmare and a grip nightmare, isn't it? You can't send out guidance and have it all done on one day. It's a bit like Sainsbury's having 5,000 outlets and all the managers doing what they want to do. It's not go. Not a go.
Yeah, sort of. But with the Devo team, we'll embed a person in the GM system who works on our behalf. We're working very much alongside them, and all the partners.
So when you say we, that's
NHSI.
not monitor.
Yeah, NHSI.
Not monitor.
Yes. So there'll be a senior independent senior individual who's working for NHSI, but with the GM.
Embedded.
Embedded.
Well, that's it. I've learned something. That's really interesting. Don't they go native?
Well, that would be absolutely thoroughly professional, and we'll never do that.
So they go native then. Yeah, right. You go down and give them a smack.
And it'll be their job to, as well as manage the regulatory thing, try and find ways to make things happen rather than find ways of finding barriers and boundaries.
Yeah. Well, that's in part, I guess, the kind of difficulties that Sam has, isn't it? Sam Jones. She was our guest one evening. She was talking about the vanguards. I mean, there's been a lot of criticism recently about the vanguards. And I don't know if you've seen it on Twitter and so on. People have been pretty excoriated about the progress they've made and the governance and what the outcomes are going to be. It's too early, I think, to pronounce on them. But quite a lot of the problems that she's had, because she's told me, have been around the regulatory issues to make things happen.
Yeah, so I started off with a vanguard in Northumbria, and I think what we found was you'd start off thinking I'd really like to do that, and there'll be a legal restriction or there'll be a regulatory burden, and almost always when you've examined it properly it doesn't actually exist. I think a lot of these things are in the mind.
Do you think people use it as an excuse for not doing it?
I think it's a barrier. There's sometimes a legitimate reason, and generally there's a workaround, but very often they're imagined, or it's a reason for somebody who isn't quite committed to it to find a reason.
It takes the creative mind, doesn't it, to do the workarounds. And I'm wondering really if you look at some of the boards and chief executives of trusts where the main burden of change lies, they're just terrified. Some of that, it was who's Dame Julie, what's her name? Moore, isn't it? Yeah. I don't know if you saw the article in the Telegraph. God knows why she said it, but she just completely slagged all the chief executives in the country off. And I think I might write about that next week. She's on holiday at the moment, and I don't want to waste it. I want to make sure she reads it. But on the other hand, it is true that I do come across some boards who you think, what a bunch of numpties. Discuss.
It was Chris Hobson reminded me early on in this job. I did something early on, I don't say what it was, but I dropped a clanger in about week 2 and try to do something, and Chris explained, he says, what you've got to remember, it's a mixed ability class. And actually, I think that's really, in every profession, in every group of people, you can have a variation. Sometimes it's ability, sometimes it's appetite, sometimes it's circumstance. It's probably all of those things, isn't it? So I don't buy we've got a load of useless people out there.
No,
I think that's absolute bollocks. I don't believe that at all. We've got a lot of people who are working very hard and have no time to think, and are very boxed in, and that's partly what our job is.
Yeah.
Get out there.
Yeah, and it's partly because they don't know what good looks like, which is wholly what we're trying to do with the academy. We show people what good looks like. Because my experience has been, if you show people what good looks like, they'll get on and do it, and they'll often do it better than it was in the first place.
Yeah.
But there isn't really a mechanism. But I do feel a lot of the boards. I mean, if you look at the mess we've got ourselves into over the strike at the moment, and you know, I know you're not able to discuss the strike. So tell me, what do you think about the strike?
So next question.
Yes, I know, doesn't it? Nobody knows what to talk about with the strike. But I mean, trusts are free to employ staff on local conditions, and I did that in 1992 because I took a look at the whole national shebang, and I said, well, I'm not having that. And Anne Eden, one of the finest managers in the NHS, is here, looking as young and lovely as ever. And we did our own local pay and conditions, didn't we? We did it, and because we looked at the nationals thing, we said, we ain't having that here. We did our own thing. And it was difficult to do, but it is, and I'm wondering really if the environment really exists today for people to be slightly buccaneering in their approach to management. They've kind of been regulated out of it, haven't they?
Yeah, but again, I think a lot of that's imagined. So you know, there are people out there all the time really pushing the boundaries. And that's what I thought our job was in Northumbria. So I don't think there's a variation, isn't there? So there's some people doing it now. There's some people would do it if they had a bit more space and time, and there's some people who would never get to that.
Yeah.
And that's where we are. On the terms and conditions thing, I know what you've said about the junior thing, but actually in most of the country, the juniors are tied together in local, regional systems. So it actually isn't practical. It's quite disruptive to have one person paying different.
Well, I'd
rates
never
to
want to
those
do
next
anything
door.
disruptive, you know that. But well, I don't buy that at all. I think if it's disruptive, we should do it. What I mean, that kind of leads me on really to the money thing, isn't it? We've got to talk about the money, the elephant in the room. There isn't any. What are we going to end up year end? Is it about 3 billion?
The provider deficit at the year end will be, I would think, probably about 2.4, maybe 2.5 deficit, and overall will be there or thereabouts on the vote. It's hard to tell because of all the other moving parts.
It'll be on the vote.
Yeah.
You understand what on the just you better explain on the vote.
Yeah. So the vote is have we overspent the amount of money that Parliament voted for the NHS? So it'll be within a couple of $100 million either side on the NHS budget. That's huge. So
it overspends the DEL. The DEL is the Departmental Expenditure Limit.
Yeah.
They have to go back to Parliament and vote more money, and that's very embarrassing for Jeremy Hunt. He will throw himself off a tall building.
It shouldn't happen, but it's you know, we've run it very close, and it's been building for 4 or 5 years. So for those people who say it's a surprise, it's been absolutely obvious for 4 or 5 years. We've just watched it get worse. We've watched A&E performance get worse. We've watched RTT performance get worse. We've watched staff surveys get worse for 4 or 5 years. So the good thing about this last 6-12 months has been a bit of a wake-up call on people eventually recognising we have to stop doing what we're doing and turn it back.
And what are we going to do? Turn it back in 1 year? Do you think in the next financial? Because if you take it out of the next year's allocation to pay off the deficit from this last year, which you can do, you then start the year behind the 8 ball again. Don't you?
So we've got the transformation fund to put a big hole in it. We'll not
but it's a shame that the
we'll
transformation fund is going to be paid on last year's debt.
It is a shame, but I'm a pragmatist. You know, there's nothing worse than being in a hospital and not having the money to pay the wages, but you can get money for something new and shiny. It's really toxic. You know, we've had too much of that in recent history. We've got to sort the basics out. So, you know, why have a house with a 20,000 square metres when you've got no electricity. So let's just get back to basics. The next couple of years are getting back to basics. We'll not get rid of all the deficit in a year, take a couple of years probably. And then, so people are saying, how's that? We've got card, we're still wasting a fortune on local agencies. There's still huge variation in productivity. The problem we've got is people don't have the time to get out. And so somewhere we've got to build it down so people can actually have a fighting chance and get onto the things that they know they've got to get onto.
Is it Lincoln today who've had to? Is it Chorley? Yes, who've had to close. I don't know if you've seen it, but they've had to close their A&E.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a disaster, isn't it? Really, they just can't. That's not a question of money. They just can't find the people who work there.
Yeah. So we have a supply problem again, which is one of the things we have to accept first of all, and then start dealing with. And the thing with the medical production
Excuse
system.
me, Sam Jones has just arrived. We've done Vanguard's, darling. You've missed it. Okay. We've agreed that they're not up to much and there's no money. Okay. Is that all right? Yeah. So Jim, he hates Vanguard.
So the problem with the medical production system is we make decisions today and we've got 15 years to wait before they actually start coming out the other end. So again, there's people in the room. We were arguing about this 10, 15 years ago. We're heading towards a big problem.
Yeah.
And so now we're in a position where we need to make some very long-term strategic decisions and tactically how we're going to fill this gap over the next few years. And surely, we've got no doctors. So it's better to run one A&E properly than two A&Es badly.
Yeah. And they're not the only one, is there? There's rumours all over the place that people are going to be faced with these problems and difficulties. It's exacerbated by the strike. I did a radio programme just recently. I think it's in Kent. They're bringing some French doctors in, and the locals are up in arms about it. And what can you do?
Yeah. So there's virtually nobody in the country yet. Well, there's nobody has too many doctors. There's a huge regional variation in where the doctor supply works and where it doesn't. And I think there's a proper let's take this to bits and understand what's going on. The local agency thing's just gone completely out of control, and I think the hope is what we don't know yet is when we eventually correct this market, what does supply look like then? Because you've got little colonies of locums who are extracting far too much money out of the NHS in very vulnerable places, and if we can address that, there will be a redistribution. It won't fully correct the problem, but it will help.
I mean, the world of work, though, has changed, hasn't it? Really? There are some people now, because of family and other commitments, they don't want the kind of career that perhaps I looked for when I was first in the NHS. So they quite like the ability to dip in and dip out of the workplace on different terms and conditions. And we somehow or other have not really got our head around that. We just assume things are going to happen.
No, I think that's right, and I think the NHS needs to get its head around their flexibility in a different way. So
I mean, certainly with the junior doctors, I mean, I've got quite close to the junior doctors' dispute, having spent some time on the picket line and talking to them. And I mean, setting aside the rights and the wrongs of whether people in vocation should go on strike, and that's, we'll all have our views about that. They actually have a very good case if you just look at it in terms of rotas, schedules, gaps in rotas, trying to stretch the workforce over a longer period. I mean, if you listen to them, you think, you know what, these are very bright people. You become a doctor because you're one of the brightest 5% in the country, and there we are having an argument with the brightest people in the country that are the backbone of our workforce over something that they are patently correct about.
So you keep talking about the strike, don't you?
I know you want to talk about it, Jim. So, yeah, I do. Yeah, it troubles me. I mean, it's difficult to get, but the whole thing troubles me because I just think that the way we treat people, and that's very much what you're saying. You get a dysfunctional board, doesn't mean to say that they're idiots. They've been made dysfunctional by circumstances, and you can do something about that. I mean, I went to a hospital, I won't name it. Junior doctors showed me where they got their meat when they were working nights. They very rarely got their 2.5 hours, and they showed me a vending machine that hadn't worked for 2 months, and that was where they're supposed to get their meal at night. and it isn't, and that is very much a condemnation of the employer. And of course, part of your job is really to get boards, and it's essentially a board issue, to perform better. And one wonders really whether or not the cadre of boards that we've got at the moment is capable of that step change, and what do we do to create that step change?
Yeah, so in the coming year we'll be doing some work with NHS providers again to try and get a bit back to basics on good board governance, composition of boards, skills, sets, balance, those sorts of things. And I remember the best 2 years of my career were the first 2 years as an FT. It was fantastic. We knew what the rules were, we had freedom, we knew what to get on with, and we had a good local plan. And the prep for the board was absolutely brilliant. Getting governance into people's minds properly, looking at the distribution and balance of skills, being clear what the plan was, and really I think we need to just get back to some of that stuff, some of the fundamentals. At the end of that, we'll have a variation, and some of that performance will be unacceptable, and we'll have to build a leadership system that produces people to fill those gaps. But more importantly, the context's got to be right for people to work in them. It's quite hard to get non-execs in chairs at the minute because of the reputational risk. So if you've had a very successful career in business and you take on the chair of a very big, complex trust, it's very, very high risk and not a very great reward at the moment. So that needs to be addressed.
There's a model, isn't there, in the city where you could be a non-executive director of more than one company.
Yeah.
Plenty of people have a portfolio career being a non-executive director. It was mooted some time ago.
That's happening.
Is it happening
Yeah,
now?
it's
Really?
happening now. So we have probably got too many organisations, and so we've got a leadership supply problem on too many organisations to fill those gaps. So there has to be a consolidation over the next couple of years. That won't address all of the issue, and it's actually much more complicated running multi-site organisations than people think. So again, part of our job will be to help develop the skill set so that a board doesn't think running one site's exactly the same as running 4 or 5. That might be 2 or 3 hours apart. It's a completely different job.
It's a step change for the boards to be able to see things in that light, I think. And the chairman's role is really very poorly defined, I think, these days. I think that often they're just left, not knowing really quite what they are supposed to do, because so much of it comes from the external boundaries rather than trying to sort themselves out internally. You don't have the space. So, transformation. I mean, what does that mean? I mean, it's a huge. I mean, where do you start? What does your transformation program look like?
I don't personally like the word.
No, it's the wrong word. If you look at the definition of it, it is the wrong word.
Job one, I think, is create the circumstances for people to be able to have a good chance to do what.
So that's stability, isn't it?
A bit of stability. So this year.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I mean, you were successful because you were at Northumberland for a while.
Yeah.
Then Fenwick down the road has been there. Well, he's been there since Florence Nightingale came to work on the bike. Andrew Morris, who I never tire of telling people was appointed 30 years ago by a very bright, intelligent, good-looking, charming chairman of the District Health Authority, that modesty prevents me from naming. So he's been there, but I can't believe he's been there for 30 years. It makes me feel so bloody old. Julie's been around for a while, hasn't she? I can't bring to mind. Yeah, David, St. David.
Yeah.
St. David's been around for a while. Stability, very important part.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think we need to encourage that. We need to try and develop people, create the circumstances that are right, be clearer on the framework. So people like rules. They like to know what the rules are that they're working to, what's expected of them, and really importantly, get the behaviours right. And I think a big problem in the last few years is the real or perceived different views of all the different national bodies, and you can do well under one regulator but be in trouble with the other. So we're working very hard to bring that into line. Frankly, in my old job, I just ignored it all. Seriously, we just ignored it all.
Yeah.
And I think that's, if you get underneath what Andrew's done and what David Dalton's doing and Andy Cash have done, they understand the regulatory system, so they try not to get into trouble with it. But then they determine their own local plan and they get on with it. and seriously, that's what we've got to do. NHSI will not be the thing that produces plans for people to follow. We'll try and create a circumstance where people can develop their own good plan and deliver it.
Has that, internally, in running the organisation, because you employ a shed load of people, that must have occasioned a kind of change in attitude from the staff who felt they were, regulators. There's a bit of that in it, isn't there? Like inspector. Yeah. It's an attitude thing. I think Ed Smith, your chairman, has done a great job.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic. So Ed was really clear from day one, what we needed to do. I've been pretty clear since the start as well. But, we're in the process of a big change program. There's about 1,000 people in NHSI monitoring TDA. People have completely different backgrounds. They were recruited for a different purpose. There's a different legal framework that still exists. So what we have to do is to get the best of it all, to be what we're talking about earlier on, get the best of it all and make it into something better. But again, that's not going to correct or fix itself tomorrow or next month. It's going to be a quite long process.
And there's no prospect of legislative changes, are there? They're not going to.
No, but again, we're just behaving as though the law has changed and we're working as one entity.
Yeah.
And we'll push that as far as we can, and we'll try not to break the law.
And where do we sit now on competition? Because that seems to me to be a real minefield.
Yeah.
A lot of what the Vanguards does, under the misguidance of the. She's tweeting. She's not listening. A lot of people. I read somewhere there's a challenge now on some of the Vanguards, or there's a challenge around some of the GPs federating. And the competition people have been very quiet for quite a time. And are they going to go to sleep permanently? Have you coshed them?
There'll be some communication will come out in the next week or so about competition law. So there'll be a broader competition law in the NHS explanation, clarification, and the NHSI competition people will put something out specifically aimed at if you're in a local situation, when would it be right for something to be put out to tender and when not? My
we
view.
did that with PCTs, and they just shot holes through it, didn't they?
Yeah. So I think it's one of those things that's probably more imagined than real. It's used actually as a tactical instrument as well in negotiations. So if you don't do this, I'll put that out to tender. That sort of things going on. So I'm absolutely certain we can comply with competition law and not put very much out to tender. But commissioners need to go through a process to make sure that the providers they're using are delivering the best services and the best value. Yeah. That doesn't mean tendering things. There's sometimes a need to do it. There's sometimes a need for market disruption and all that. But it's not. So I think my point, and I think Ed said this before, the competition law is not the only tool, and it's certainly not the first one you get out of the box. You need to think about the circumstances in which it's useful.
If we move to accountable care organisations, which I must say I'm a big fan of, and they look to me like a district health authority. We've moved to accountable care organisations. The scope then for competition within that vertically integrated framework pretty much disappears. And one wonders really whether or not that is likely to be challenged.
Well, again, I think in the ACO development, again, as party to this last year, you have to build in safeguards to protect the patient interest and protect patient choice. So I think that's just about how you do it. Even within an ACO, you can still decide to test the market and the use of the provider. So an ACO system isn't about local monopolies. So you just apply the same principles. All the competition law stuff is about protecting the patient interest. And you can absolutely do that without tendering things. But sometimes you might have to, and you just need to make sure that you're not crossing the line and make sure whatever we do, we mustn't go back to creating local monopolies that don't care about the people they're looking after. And we'll be, our regulatory system will focus on that rather than things that are being put out to tender every 2 or 3 years. I mentioned earlier, I trained in local government in the 80s, and local government had all this competition. Law was brought in, compulsory competitive tendering. After a few years.
The bin men, do you remember?
Absolutely.
Mrs. Thatcher rang up one day and said, the bin men, you're going to privatise them. I said, have you met our bin men?
And that morphed into a best value regime.
It did.
if you remember.
Yeah.
So I think we're probably at the phase of morphing into a best value regime rather than a arm wrestle tendering process. And again, with all these things, think about the patient. So if you've got an integrated system, you want to put something out to tender and you break it up, how the hell is that better for patients? So, I think when I see this going wrong and how people have helped resolve some problems in this regard in the last few weeks, it's where people have lost sight of what they're there for.
Come unstuck, is it in Cambridge, the £800 million?
Yeah.
What's happened there?
Well, I think I wasn't around when it was set up. I remember watching it thinking, I can't see how that works. And we've proven that because there was a bit of a, so going back to the earlier point, it looks like, I might be completely wrong and there's good colleagues involved in it, looks like there was a rush to something shiny and new without really thinking about what it was supposed to do, and importantly, when it goes wrong, who's accountable. And linked to that, when you run out of cash, who pays the wages? We're running a public service, we're people, and we employ people. So to get into that position where you haven't actually thought about it, it's criminal, it shouldn't happen. So we will make sure we're upstream far enough to kick the tyres, and if there's a novel new way of delivering services, that's great, but let's not look at an institutional model first and then work back and try and convince ourselves it's good for patients.
Let's talk about Carter for a minute. Lord Carter's coming to do an evening with us. I mean, he's a lovely guy, isn't he? And he's got. If you haven't booked the ticket to come to Carter, then do, because he has a really interesting background. And he's, but I mean, he's completely wrong with his report, isn't he? I mean, he just reinvented Stalin.
You're very vague in your comments, aren't you? Pat's, as you say, a lovely guy, very clever, very capable. He's been successful in everything that he's done in all of his life.
It's a shame that he's arrived at the.
No. What I would say in the Carter thing is it would be impossible for anybody to produce that kind of analysis and be absolutely right. It's not possible. So we should just not even think that. In every organisation, his number probably isn't right, but No's nil. So we should stop, those that are worried saying, I'm down for 10 million and I don't think it's 10. Work out what the right bloody number is and get it out, because it's definitely not nil. And you're definitely not more efficient than absolutely everybody else on everything. And it's a start of a process, it's not an end.
I do like the benchmarking approach, because that sits very well with our agenda about showing people what good looks like. But I'm not sure that the NHS has got the reporting systems that are robust enough really to contribute accurately to the benchmarking system.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think if you look at a lot of the stuff on nursing productivity, we're relying on ward management systems and rostering systems that are
nursing hours per patient a day, for God's sake, you can see, I mean, I wrote about this the other day, you can see how they're going to fiddle this. It's care hours per patient, and that's going to include nurses, chiropodists, nutritionists, physiotherapists, occupational therapists. You're going to lump all the lot together and say, do you know what? The care hours per patient day has gone through the roof. This is marvellous. Wonderful. But we haven't got any nurses. So, and how often do you see a nutritionist if you're in there?
But that goes back to your point earlier on about the board.
It's a fiddle.
It's not a fiddle. The board needs to look at what it needs in every ward and department. And I've never believed that means somebody turns up and says, show me 8 nurses. Because on that ward, if it's a stroke ward, you might need 8 nurses, but you might need 4 physios, you might need 3 OTs. We've completely ignored all that team stuff. And
you did that, didn't you, at your hospital? I mean, when Terry and I came out, we were very impressed with the way you'd organised that. And to a large extent, I think that the nurses were determining the staffing levels themselves.
So I remember when we set off on that. So again, we determined as a board we would ignore the 1 to 8 thing. And what we would do, we would decide ourselves with our staff what was right. And I had a fantastic nurse director who's just recently retired. I worked with her for nearly 30 years.
Remind us of
Rosemary Stevens.
That's right, Rosemary.
She was a Sunderland supporter, sadly, but we're not worried too much about that. And so Rosemary, on one of the exercises, sat down with a ward team, and the logic would have been they needed whatever it was, an extra 8 nurses. But they decided what they actually wanted to do was, instead of having 30 beds, they would drop to 20. So the ratios all improved, but importantly, it was all more within reach. It was all more manageable. It's a lot of single rooms, and that worked fantastically well. So I think what we need is the nurse director and the ops director and the FD to be able to get into that kind of detail with their teams and determine what's right. They'll be accountable if they've done something really stupid, if they've ignored evidence, if they've ignored the staff, if they've ignored poor outcomes. But generally, we've got good people who make right decisions. So I don't believe you can turn up in every ward and say, show us 8 people and it'd be right everywhere. It can't be right.
Yeah, but the danger is with the benchmarking thing that you're going to end up with a very befuddle, and then you're at the top of the benchmark or the bottom of the benchmark.
Yeah, so on
you do really need to get rid of all that.
So the way out on that, Roy, is I think that benchmarking stuff is yours. You forget comparing yourself with anybody else on that sort of thing, and you try and improve over time yourself. So baseline might be, on this ward, we think we've got 10,000 hours a year directly focused on patients. And by sorting out the catering and sorting out the portering and sorting out the amount of forms they've got to fill in, we're going to increase that by 20%. Ignore everybody else. But if you've got better over time, we're all happy. And importantly, engage with your relatives and the patients when they're coming in and try and determine then what's appropriate.
Asking the front line, I know you've made a career out of that. When we come up, we were very interested in the design of your A&E, which I must say I didn't like at all. But it was designed by your people, wasn't it? I thought that it was very interesting. They had a circular nursing station. This is really clever how they did it. We went in there and there were like 3 chairs, weren't there, in the bench in the circular workstation, and so there was like nowhere for anybody to sit down, which I thought was quite cunning. But all of the input stations had screens that faced out of the donut, outwards. So you stood and inputted outward. And of course, if you stand and input, 1, you spend less time doing it, and 2, you got room to put more screens in. And I thought that was a really subtle, clever thing. But I thought the way the spurs went off with the doors and the screen, that seemed to me to run counter to everything I've ever been taught and known about observation.
Yeah, and we learned a lot in that from the Hexham build, which was all very much entirely almost single rooms. And we learned a lot about observation and how things might look easy, but in practice it's actually quite hard for the staff to do. So the staff who'd worked on that helped design the new emergency hospital, same architect. And so they took a lot of those ideas and adapted them for real life. It's not perfect, it's been open about 8 months or so, and they're going through a refined process now, and it will be adapted and changed. But I think, you see that all over the country. The key thing is, don't design a hospital in a dark room and then tell the staff to work in it. Yeah. How would health and anyone think that's right?
Yeah, it is interesting. Right, okay, let's, anybody got any thoughts, any questions that they'd like to ask Jim? Who'd like to go? Have you got some on Twitter?
Twitter questions.
Yeah.
So, well, we won't ask, are Newcastle going down? We won't ask.
Yes, we will. Are Newcastle going down? No. Do you think so? What would you do about Newcastle?
Well, strangely, I'm actually looking forward to being relegated. I'm stupidly competitive, so it's unusual for me. But football's not football anymore. So 2nd tier football's more like proper football again. So let's have a bit of that.
Okay, question from Claire Murdoch.
Oh, Claire, say good evening, Claire.
She's very sorry she can't be here.
Okay, let's just explain. Claire Murdoch is one of our best chief executives who runs a horrendously complicated and difficult London mental health services, and she's an absolute heroine.
Okay, so she's asked, could we ask Jim about the guidance to CCGs on funding mental health services, and whether you think they're being followed, and what can you do?
Is Claire watching on Periscope?
She's now.
Is she?
We're currently
Sorry, Claire, we've run out of time, love.
We've currently still got quite a big gap between commissioners and providers in the planning and contracting realm, which you could have expected because it's an important year, so the pressure's really on. The deal that Simon and I agreed on at the start of the process was we had to deploy the transformation fund largely at the acute sector to largely address emergency care pressures. So that's why that was distributed in that way. For community and mental health providers, they should expect a level of growth that honours previous pledges and is broadly in line with the growth in the CCG allocation. And that's what we would expect to see in the planning round. We're currently not at that in that position. We're not in that position across the acute sector either. So when we kick the tyres over the next couple of weeks, that's the benchmark we'll be going back to. And it's going to be really hard for commissioners to afford that. But if I was a community or mental health provider, that's what I would be aiming for. Is that clear?
Did you get all that into 140
Well, do you know,
characters?
I've gone, Claire watched Periscope. Great answer.
Okay. I'll come to you Seb, in a minute. Yeah.
Just a slightly
Just tell us who you are and the name of your company.
James Wilson from Assisted Consulting.
And a jolly fine company it is too. Yeah.
A slightly technical accounting question. Is NHSI going to stick to Bonus's deadline 2018 for the trust to adhere to patient level costing as a condition of their licence?
Probably.
Good answer.
So I frankly couldn't care less about the regulatory need of that. But what we've lost in the last few years, we had a good few years in the largely in the FT sector, and then it went into the non-FT sector, about the development of costing, the development of service line management. And for me, that wasn't a technical accounting thing. It was about bringing managers and clinicians together, understanding what we're doing, what was good, what wasn't bad. And we've lost a lot of that in the last couple of years of mayhem. And I think we need to, as quickly as we can, get back to that kind of technical discipline that facilitates good behaviour. So it might get rephrased, I'm not as up to speed on clicks and all those things as I used to be. So the principle for me would be better costing, more patient level costing, more accuracy, but most importantly, engagement between the finance people, your management team and the clinical staff.
But the approach to patient level costing, it is important. I mean, we tried to do back in the 1990s. We couldn't find a computer big enough in those days that would run the Excel spreadsheet. But I came in from industry and, I said, what is this product costing us? The product being a satisfied patient that's gone through the system. What does it cost them? Nobody could tell us. Yeah. They just took the annual allocation and divided it by the number of patients and said that's the answer.
Yeah. And I think because of, nearly everybody being in deficit, that kind of precision kind of doesn't, you can see why it might not make that much of a difference, because overall it's just massively out of sync. So it goes back to the earlier point, let's get the thing into sync overall and get back into those discipline things that actually keep you safe long term.
So,
Sebastian Ewan, consultant paediatrician and also fellow at the NHS Institute for Innovation and Improvement. How will you use the patient safety and quality improvement resources that you've got?
We've got a really
use it to wipe out the deficit.
Yes. There's a really complex pitch on improvement, on leadership development, those sorts of things where there's just lots and lots of parts of the NHS are doing things. So the safest thing I think for us to do is to make sure we know where they all are and what they're doing and try and put our arms around them. So we'll not be looking for things to shut down, we'll be looking for way, and we'll not be saying NHSI is the only source of this. We'll be trying, largely through the improvement faculty, is to put our arms around it and make it clear what they're doing, where there's good practice, what it is, try and share it, and develop and nurture it. And over the next few years it will kind of get rationalised and it will make more sense. But if we all did a test now and said, name all of the institutions that are responsible for leadership development or quality improvement or clinical development, we'd all get it wrong. We'd all miss 5 or 6 organisations easily. It's just far too messy.
Yeah, hi Jim. Richard Phillips, AVHI with the medical device people. We were quite close with Pat Carter actually and developing his report. And, we're involved in a project with the Carter team at the moment looking to see if we can do some of his metrics. Yeah. And we look forward to working with that as well. The one question I've got for you is a really fundamental one. It strikes me you've got a very fundamental job. It seems to me a lot of the woes that we're facing at the moment, we've known about and understood for years, if not decades. I first heard about population pyramids and the demographic time bomb in what used to be called the first fall. It was about 40 years ago now. It seems to me we've just stood back and watched that time bomb explode in super slow motion. We haven't made adequate provision for pensions, for housing stock, for transport of skills with people that are going to work much longer than they have. And in healthcare, we've insisted with our emotional attachment to hospitals and the healthcare system that's designed to treat acute illness, and we all know we've got the problem is acute illnesses. Why chronic illnesses? Why have we not been able to respond?
I don't know. It's a really complex question, that one. And so I think a lot of these things. I'm an accountant, but I believe a lot of what we do is all about the mind. It's all about behaviour. It's all about the psychology of it. And because probably the answer to deal with something felt horrible, we've had this terrible avoidance thing on lots of things. We're not alone. If we're having this conference in Sweden or in the States or in Australia, people will be talking about the same worries everywhere, and largely systems elsewhere. Nearly everywhere they're worse than the NHS. So we shouldn't be too negative about the NHS. It's still the best in the world, certainly pound for pound. And a big part of, I think, what I have to do and NHSI has to do is to make sure we're not avoiding the tricky stuff. You can't fix tricky stuff if you avoid it. So we have to start, when we are, get some of this stuff on the table. A lot of it's really, really complicated. And if I don't know how many people here are from acute providers. I run a combined, community acute social care, primary care organisation, etc. Completely buy all of the shift the model out of hospital. But if you're running an A&E and you can't see beyond the queue of ambulances because that's actually not what's happening, it's really hard. It's really hard to convince people that it's right. So we need more people, going back to the Vanguard point, we need more people to show they've actually done it. They've actually shifted the plan. They've worked with primary care to stop a load of people turning up at A&E who should be seen in primary care. We've worked on how to stop admitting people in the last 48 hours of their life and do lumbar punctures and everything else that we do to them when they should have been more humanely looked after at home. But it's big and complex, isn't it? I think the first thing is let's just get it all out on the table, however uncomfortable, and we'll try and deal with it.
On the academy, I think I'm right, Terry, on the academy we had 27 shares on discharge,
preventing delayed discharge,
and
prevention of readmission,
and discharge to assess, and we I mean, it's just amazing. People are doing it, and the problem is that it's getting other people to realise they're doing it. And we had a whole load of stuff on delayed discharge.
But it's more formalised now with the ESIS collaboration we have. So the ESIS network, which is looking at flow through hospitals, and they're producing some really fantastic work for and sharing with us.
I can't say I don't want to advertise the academy, because I do, but I mean the fact is that people do share stuff, and they're starting to, and we have a collaboration coming up with you, with your committee that's so big you could see it from outer space. I thought Tim Kelsey did big committees until I came and we did yours. Let's talk about politics for a minute. I mean, not politics, but I have to say that I watched you at the Public Accounts Committee. Was that your first hearing, or was it the Health Select Committee?
I think I've done 2 PACs and 1 health.
Yeah, I watched your first one, and I just thought you did it with consummate ease. You were just terrific. What was it like to be inside you doing that and that? Because if you've ever gone and done one of these, it is nerve-wracking, even if you know your stuff. But I think you were terrific at that.
I thought you said I had a wonky tie.
Yes, you did, actually.
It is. I mean, it is. These things are nerve-wracking. But again, I've attended some horrible scrutiny committees in my time, and some horrible public meetings and all those sorts of things. So PAC and Health Select Committee was actually, it's challenging, but they're intelligent people, they're well briefed, it's very polite. You know, you're not going to get filled in on the way out, which is how it feels. It's ridiculous.
Which we just had a night, but I remember one night I got my car scratched and then we got things thrown at us.
Yeah, a lot of NHS managers, I was talking to one earlier on who nearly got through under a train by 3 people after a difficult meeting. So, and I think in all these things you just need to know your facts. And
do you think they are well briefed? I
think they're well briefed, absolutely. And I think the second one I did were incredibly well briefed.
Yes, I thought that was
right. Great challenge. And I really believe in that accountability thing. And we need to be much more accountable directly to our public. So a big part of the strength of the FT movement for me wasn't the ability to borrow and all those things, which nearly nobody's exercised anyway. It was hardwiring public accountability in your governance system. That changed how we work more than anything else. So any form of accountability, I'm really big on making people accountable to the staff as well. If you're not accountable to your staff, not accountable to your public, you're accountable to nobody, and you shouldn't be doing what you're doing.
You were thrown in the deep end, weren't you? I mean, within a couple of weeks of getting the job, you were thrown in to do it.
Yeah, you've got no choice. When you go to these things, you get a load of briefings about parliamentary law and what can happen to you. You tell lies and all those sorts of things. So, you know, focuses the mind, makes you prepared.
Yeah, I thought you did very well. Right, who else has got something they want to ask? Yes, sir. It's ma'am. Is it right at the back? Yes. Give us a couple of lungfuls so we can hear you.
Yes, Mary Black. I'm a doctor currently with public health England, before with the Homerton. There's a lot of us very pleased with you as much because you're direct and you don't bullshit, which I think is what we all need. But you've got a lot of cobwebs to blow away, and one of the biggest messes we're all subjected to is in the execution of duties of the bodies you've inherited. It comes across as death by a million emails, Excel spreadsheets that we all have to fill in triplicate, duplicate, and another part of the organisation is requesting the same thing at the same time. And it's very old-fashioned. Now, do you have a plan to clean some of this, to cut it out, to streamline it, to...
It'll be a part of, we had a discussion yesterday about our draft business plan. First of all, we've recognised it. It's been a bit difficult for colleagues to recognise some of that, and it will be a big part of our work. And importantly as well, we're going to try and create a system. We might not be able to do this, but try and create a system where if a provider has a difficulty, between all the national bodies, we agree that there's one of us talk to the provider. So if you've got an A&E problem, rather than your CCG ring you up, your area team ring you up, monitor or TDA ring you up, and then the CQC are going to turn up. All those things happen at the minute. Let's stand back for a minute. And Anne and I were in a meeting the other day, and I think for us there's a thought process of the right thing actually might be to not do anything. And a lot of what we're seeing a lot of the time is people feel the need to do something because they're there, they need to do something. But actually if you're a provider and you're in a bit of trouble, what you probably need more than anything else is time. And you need a bit of flexibility, and you need people to have. So that's hard for us because we need to have the confidence to do that, and we need to be confident that people will actually do the right thing and get on their feet. So hopefully that'll, we're going to really work at trying to rebalance that.
And so often, I mean, you make a very good point. So often, the trouble that people get into is because of the interrelationships in the local health economy. I mean, you go to places, you can almost. It's almost defined by geography. If you've got a hospital near a coast, you'll have trouble recruiting.
Yeah.
You know, if you've got a hospital in downtown somewhere or other, you'll have trouble getting consultants. I mean, you don't have to go and see. You just look at the map and say there'll be problems here, 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 and there. Put the overlay on and say, bingo, I'm right.
Yeah.
And the ability to assess the whole environment within which the business activity takes place is something we've not been able to achieve.
Yeah, and that is actually more predictable than people think in the way you describe it.
Yeah.
So between Sam and ourselves, we've got some work looking at the future of the small DGH. Our most fragile ones are remote. They are generally around the coast because the training and production hub is a long way from them. Doctors like to live with other doctors. It's quite hard to get doctors to move out of the cities, etc. It's quite risky, it's scary. So we need a solution for that. And I think one of the, in the northeast we have robust relationships. It's a northeast traders directness thing, so I'm not alone. So we used to have arguments with each other, but we actually met and discussed things and shook hands on things, and things got done. I've been really struck in this job how many health communities don't actually have people sitting in a room talking to each other. You can't ever fix anything if you don't talk to anybody. So, I've been in places where a trust didn't know who the director of social care was, and they've got problems with detox. How the hell is that? How does that work? I don't understand.
Patrick, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm kind of interested. Attended the, as a member of the public, attended the NHS England board meeting recently.
How very sad.
And the Simon Stevens sort of opening statements, I thought, sort of make quite a point about actually, I think in some of the stats he was giving, that the demand pressures weren't year on year that great, that much greater on the hospital sector than they had been. So I don't know whether that was just posturing leading up to the contracting round, or whether that's a fair statement and therefore the deficits are other things other than the demands, which is what we always hear about.
Okay, so Simon.
Did everybody hear that?
No.
You just up something and then answer it.
So Simon in the last NHS England board referred to some statistics about hospital demand and pointed out that in his view there hadn't been a huge increase in demand year on year. Simon and I will talk about this tomorrow. We have a slightly different view on the numbers, which is the first point. We should have one set of numbers between us all rather than arguing about I think it's 3%, he thinks it's 2 or whatever, because it's all coming from the same source. So we need to fix that. The key point, I think, is if you look at the activity, certainly from an emergency point of view, cumulatively, for the year, I can't remember the number, it was about 2% or 3% more than the previous year, which doesn't sound a lot. First of all, margins are extremely tight. But most importantly, hospitals have a pattern and a cycle. So what's important operationally is you compare January this year with January last year. Because you hit Christmas and you think it's going to ease off in February. But if February, which it was this year, was nearly 20% higher than last February, that's operationally really painful. Because those of you that do this, when in your quiet periods, when you're used to it being quiet, you allow annual leave to happen, you allow people to do training, all those sorts of things. And then, so what we've actually had since Christmas is we've had 3 months that were broadly 15 to 20% higher than the same period last year. There's not a system anywhere can cope with that. If a system can cope with that, it's got far too much resource. So no wonder A&E performance is dreadful. We've definitely got variation in performance. We've definitely got problems with grip, but we've got problems where a lot of people, and most of these are minors, so they're not being admitted. A lot of people are reporting they're coming to A&E because they can't access primary care and they're swamping local ED departments. And we need to fix that somehow. The argument, how we fix it, there's lots of different ways of trying to do it. There's different completely polarised views on it, but we need to address it. So going back to your point, the thing we can't do is pretend it's not happening. Because in all of our A&E departments all over the country, people are on their knees.
So, when you're at the Monday morning meetings at number 10, how are you getting on with Oliver Letwin?
Oliver's great. Actually, he's a big supporter of the NHS and providers as well. So
say that again.
He's very good, and it's your overtime.
Do you really think that Oliver Letwin is a big supporter of the NHS?
I do actually.
Do you?
Absolutely.
What about Camilla? How are you getting on with her?
Very well.
Yeah?
I get on with everybody.
Yeah, I know. That's the trouble. You're one of the nicest men I've ever spoken to, and a way of saying our thanks to you for being with us tonight. We always give our guests a little gift, which regulars will know what it is. If you're not a regular, we give you a bottle of whiskey. Now, the thing about this whiskey is it's the best whiskey in the world. It fuels most of the things I write. It's Penderyn whiskey. It's Welsh whiskey. And it's the best whiskey in the world. And the most interesting thing about it is it's just above the cost of it is just above the limit that you have to declare. and I just love the thought that our name is sprinkled around government with having bunged people a bottle of whiskey. You've been a fabulous guest and very frank, and it's been a joy, and we wish you luck on your journey. Thank you very much. Right, that's your lot on Periscope. We're here again in a month's time. Who have we got speaking to in a month's time?
We've got Niall Dixon in 2 weeks.
Yeah, Neil Dixon is a fantastic guy, former health correspondent at the BBC, went on, prior to that he was the editor of Nursing Times, went on to run the KingsFund here, and then from here he's gone off and now he's the regulator of the GMC, and made a complete mess of that. But he will come and explain himself, and he'll be, I promise you, he's a wonderful raconteur, lots of stories, and he will be really interesting. Then the next one after that is Carter.
Lord Carter, 18th of May.
Lord Carter of Bog Roll, lovely guy, and he's telling us how to buy cheaper bog rolls. And because it's him, what we're going to do is we rolled 2 tickets in at a discount price, so you can buy one for Neil and one for Carter. We just do that. So thank you. So just let you know we've got our procurement sorted out. So anyway, so I hope you've had a good evening. Anybody had a good evening? Right. Thank you very much for watching us. And please, you can't do this on Periscope, but if you were here, you could come and join us for a drink. So thank you very much for watching. And good night.